fire that broke out last night. It's just awful. But I'm talking with East Coast people this morning about how they view this. Noah Rothman, senior political writer for National Review, joins me. Noah, I talked with Vic Mattis about this. I am curious. You're an East Coaster. What do you make of the mayhem in California, and how much mind space does it take up? Because it's truly the greatest catastrophe I've been close to in my life.
Yeah, so I can only speak for myself there, and my initial reaction to the initial fires, I'll be them somewhat out of season, was that this is sort of what you should come to expect from life in Southern California. We've been dealing with this now for the better part of a decade, but as the disaster began to unfold and broaden in the scope, and now lasting into several days, the scale and scope of it has become clear to me from my far-removed vantage 3,000 miles away. And it's illustrative, I think, of a crisis of overconfidence among Democratic elected officials. There's a Nate Glazer quote that the commentary folks like me cite on a very regular basis. He delivered this lecture, I think in 1993 or something along those lines, in which he identified a real paradigmatic problem among progressive lawmakers in municipalities insofar as they convince themselves that their job is not to make the trains run on time. It's not to pick up garbage. It's not to stop crime. It's not to stop broken windows. It's not to do the things that cities know how to do. It's to do things that no one knows how to do, like end racism and eliminate poverty and make the weather change, the sort of things that no politician has control over, but are convenient excuses to explain the failures of municipal government. I know we've seen this across the board when it comes to the blue state model, whether it's forestry management and fire control and prevention, which we know how to do, which southern states have been doing very effectively for decades. Indeed, they're probably a decade ahead when it comes to the science and efficacy of this sort of thing. Delivering power, delivering energy and fuel to homes, making sure you don't have to experience rolling blackouts because it's a virtuous sacrifice on your part for the benefit of Mother Earth, on and on and on. The model that blue states and blue governors and blue municipal leaders have appealed to is one that compels their citizens to accept dysfunction in the name of broader, grander objectives. And they should subordinate their discomfort to those objectives. And people are becoming sick of it, and they really should be, because we know how to operate and manage government effectively. It's just that the people we elect don't want to do it anymore.
Do people know? I mean, I know that, you know that. California worked under Pete Wilson. Now, Pete's a good friend of mine. I met the fetching Mrs. Hewitt at a Pete Wilson fundraiser in 1978 when I first moved to California. California, under Ronald Reagan and Pete Wilson and George Duke-Majan, worked. And they had plans, and they wanted to build water reservoirs. They wanted to build desalination plants. They wanted to do all sorts of different things. It no longer worked. It's a failed state. There are other failed states in the United States, but I look at New York City as a public safety problem, Chicago as a public safety problem, and a collapse in the education, and California is an accumulation of crises. Does the message get through at some level at the base Democratic voter, Noah?
It does. No, it registers at the very, the amygdala, like in the fear center. They understand that there are consequences for maladministration and bad government, mismanagement. But what intervenes in that process and stops the conclusion from reaching, the point at which it would manifest in action are all the other inducements from constituent groups that now depend on mismanagement and maladministration. Environmental, the people who benefit from environmental regulatory checks and environmental legislation that prevents people from building, tort lawyers who benefit from the corruption at the ground level and the failures of the ability to get people to get permits to build, for example. And constituent groups that say, well, we can't actually police crime, for example. We can't police crime among illegal immigrants because we're violating due process rights and the Constitution and what have you. And these are, everybody deserves to be heard. Everybody has a constitutional right to lobby their government. But to be prohibitive, to pay prohibitive attention to these constituent groups with their various disparate, very parochial interests, to a degree that it paralyzes you and disadvantages you because you're ignoring a much broader host just to satisfy these very marginal constituent groups, is probably is the reason why Democrats find themselves in the place they're in. And they just can't get out of this doom loop, because if they were to sacrifice one group, throw somebody under the bus, Sister Soldier moment, as it were, all the other groups perceive themselves to be, or they, at least those who engage in the thought process, think that if they're throwing somebody else under the bus, all the other groups go with them. So they're not sacrificing one constituency. They're sacrificing the whole progressive diaspora. All of them are in this, amalgam in their heads. And it's a paralytic.
So I got to ask you a quick question and a big question. Quick question is, you threw an anatomical reference at me about the what part of the brain were you talking about there? That's why I love reading Noah. What is it?
The amygdala, the fear center, I believe. I'm not not an expert on the brain, but that's what I think.
Well, you're a lot more of an expert on the brain than I am. I didn't know we had a fear center. The second thing is, you're a young man. I'm an old man. You have young children. I have grandchildren. The question becomes, I really have no idea what this blue world, California, New York, Chicago, is going to look like in 30 years. I mean, are we talking about a Mogadishu? What do you expect to happen in these places?
Well, I don't know about that. I'm certainly hoping we don't have, armed warlords creating little fiefdoms in a lawless future Los Angeles. I don't know what it's going to look like. We're going to see more the flight of the tax base, to the point at which it is no longer absorbable. At a certain point, you can only wring so much money out of the constituencies you have left, and at that point, you either appeal to the federal government for bailouts, or you accept bankruptcy and restructuring. That's pretty much the trajectory on which a lot of these cities are on, Chicago in particular, but Los Angeles isn't far behind. And yeah, it's one of those things where things that cannot go on forever will not. I think paraphrase the economist, I forget his name. But nevertheless, eventually these cities will encounter material conditions in which they can progress no further beyond them. And usually that has a lot to do with money and lawsuits. And we're going to see.
Oh my God. If you could see, Noah, I don't know how much of this you've seen. Pacific Palisades may be the most expensive neighborhood in the United States. I don't know if there's a home there that was destroyed that was under $3 million. These are very influential, very successful technocrats, Hollywood people. They're the best of the brightest of the left coast. If this doesn't do something, I don't know what will. If it doesn't make people stand up and say, my God, we can't keep governing this way. But I don't think it will. I actually don't think it will. What do you think?
Yeah, well, how would that happen, Hugh? Because you would have to see a reaction from this constituency, which has been the most pliant, which has been the most willing to absorb the kind of discomfort we were talking about earlier in the name of all these grand causes. They convince themselves that, there's a lot of disadvantage out there, and maybe we're doing pretty well for ourselves. And it's kind of an altruistic impulse that, we should endure because others suffer elsewhere in the universe. And maybe that rationalization process continues. Maybe they manage to convince themselves that, this is just the cost of doing business in the social justice environment that we want to see in the world. I don't know. They've been able to rationalize the kind of unacceptable mismanagement and maladministration they've been experiencing for decades. So why would that stop now?
Water pressure failing to appear and fires destroying thousands of homes are the sort of moment that might present a path forward. But I got to tell you, the one thing I think is that the red states are going to get redder and the blue states are going to get bluer, because the people who have got half a brain are going to get out of these places. Last word to you, Noah.
No, it seems to be the case. There is some evidence that the people who move from California to Texas, for example, do bring their slightly left of center politics with them, and we have seen some evidence of that. But for the most part, the people who are getting out of blue states because they oppose the blue state model do so because they like the red state model and vote to continue that way. I expect to see this level of dysfunction continue for a significant amount of time, up to the point at which we see people no longer subordinate their basic elementary demands of good governance to high-minded ideological abstractions. At the point at which we see people say,
that's very well put. I hope you write that, Noah. That is in fact the problem, is that picking up the trash and making the fire hydrants work is very low on the priority of the California Coastal Commission. I hope you write that.
Nate Glazer prescribed the solution to this almost 40 years ago now. And it's time for us to revisit, the wisdom of the people who actually knew how to make government work. That we decided all of a sudden we knew so much better than them. We didn't. It's time to go back.
And James Q. Wilson, who came out here to try to save California. Nathan Glazer, James Q. Wilson, the entire commentary crowd, they actually knew what was coming. Noah Rothman, thank you.